Welcome to the 2022 GSA SmartPay training forum. This class is GSA SmartTax Leading Practices and Lessons Learned for State Taxes. This will be a short pre-recorded session, and most of the session will be focused on reviewing the available state sales tax exemption resources on the GSA SmartPay website, answering any questions you may have, and sharing best practices and lessons learned. My name is Andrew Lee, and I am a business management specialist from the GSA Center for Charge Card Management. Please note that I'm not a tax attorney or trained tax specialist. I am, however, the point of contact for our program for state sales tax issues, as I've worked with and alongside subject matter experts and specialists about these issues for more than 10 years. The material presented today has been consolidated not just based on GSA experience, but also feedback and best practices from agencies, state tax offices, and merchants. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. The best way to contact me is through email. My email address is andrew.lee@gsa.gov. And for folks overseas or out west, I'm usually available during business hours on Eastern Time. This class is designed for charge card managers of all levels and experience. Likely those who are newer to charge card management will find the class more helpful, but being confused and frustrated about when charge card holders should or shouldn't pay taxes isn't just reserved for newbies. We hope to provide enough information for a baseline level of knowledge of how we at the GSA Center for Charge Card Management, merchants, and even some states view state tax assessment. I also hope to introduce you to tools and resources that are shareable with your cardholders and merchants. The goal is to make the process for determining where and when to pay state sales tax a less anxiety-filled and stressful experience, as I know everyone seems to have at least one horror story about state sales tax. One note: this class is likely most relevant for AOPCs and approving officials in managing purchase, travel, integrated business line solutions. Even though the content can apply to fleet transactions, taxes are usually processed differently by fleet merchants and the fleet-specific networks. For those of you hoping to take a more in-depth look at fleet taxes, please consider taking the GSA Fleet Management Essentials course as offered by the GSA Center for Charge Card Management. Here are some of the common questions I get. I'm a federal government employee and my cardholders are too. Aren't we exempt from all taxes? What do we do when hotels and merchants don't want to exempt transactions from taxes, even if those states should honor tax exemption? There are so many different tax exemption forms for different states. Isn't there just one standard form somewhere we can use? I have cardholders that choose to use personal cards and are assessed taxes in tax-exempt states. Should that be happening? What authority does the federal government have for these issues? Today, we will try and address all of those questions and hopefully more. To give you a more comprehensive understanding of state sales tax issues, we're going to tackle this from a few angles. We'll explore the legal history of state sales tax assessment, discuss what the courts have ruled and how it applies to tax exemption. We'll then discuss how cardholders can determine if and when they need to pay taxes and what forms may or may not be required. Next, I'll discuss some lessons learned from our office and the resources available. As a reminder, the topics that we will be discussing will be for informational purposes only and should not be considered a formal interpretation of the law, tax advice, or recommendations to changes to existing policy, as I am not a lawyer or tax policy expert. Let's jump right in and discuss the legal history and precedents that inform state tax exemption. Reviewing the information will help us understand what authority the federal government does and does not have, and the role of the states and merchants in the tax collection process. Let's look at the two types of accounts available under the GSA SmartPay program. Centrally billed accounts are accounts for which the federal government is directly billed for purchasing activity. The government directly pays the vendor, which in this instance is the GSA SmartPay contractor bank. In other words, the government buys an item or service, and it directly pays for that item or service. We'll review this in a few slides, but centrally billed accounts are purchase, centrally billed travel, GSA tax advantage, fleet, and integrated accounts. Individually billed accounts are accounts for which an agent of the federal government may make a purchase. However, the individual is liable for that payment. The federal government is responsible for reimbursing the individual, but the responsibility for making the payment is not directly the government's responsibility. The only GSA SmartPay product that is individually billed is the individually billed travel account. To summarize, for centrally billed accounts, the government is liable for payment. For individually billed accounts, the individual federal employee using the charge card is liable for payment. What you are seeing here is known as the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution. This clause establishes that the Constitution and established federal laws to be the supreme law of the land over state laws. Several Supreme Court and federal court cases applied the Supremacy Clause in determining if and when the federal government or instrumentalities and representatives of the government are responsible for paying state sales tax. Just a brief summary of some of the relevant cases. In McCullough v. Maryland, the state of Maryland tried to impose a tax on a newly established national bank. The court ruled that the federal government has implied powers that are not explicitly established in the Constitution. The ruling concluded that a state cannot directly assess taxes on a federally established entity. In U.S. v. New Mexico and Alabama v. King and Boozer, federal contractors argued that the federal government's exemption for state taxes should extend to entities or individuals supporting federal government activities and using federal funds. The court ruled that immunity from state taxation cannot be conferred to these entities, like contractors, just because the federal government ultimately bears the financial or operational burden. In other words, just because something is paid for ultimately with federal dollars does not automatically mean the entity or person making the payment shares the federal government's tax exemption status. What this all means is that the states retain the sovereign right to assess taxes on any entity or individual it deems eligible. The only exception is for applicable federal government transactions. This applies to both agents and instrumentalities of the federal government. What's important to take away here is how the court defines agents and instrumentalities of the federal government. It's not based on employment by the federal government, but on liability of payment being made. When the government is directly liable for payment, states cannot assess tax, and specifically state sales tax. If an individual is liable for payment, the states have the right to assess the tax, even if the government later reimburses the employee. What this all means is there's a legal precedent to support tax exemption for purchases made with centrally billed accounts. However, any individually billed travel account can be subject to state sales tax, meaning all states and U.S. territories should exempt state sales tax for purchase, centrally billed travel, GSA travel tax advantage, fleet, and integrated accounts. States are not required to exempt state sales tax for individually billed accounts. Note that even if an agency uses a process like split disbursement, which means that an individual still has an individually billed travel account, the agency just makes a payment on behalf of the individual. The payment liability is still on the individual or cardholder. Also note that agencies are still liable for fees, as those are not defined as a state sales tax. Next, let's talk about the practical and operational applications for your program. I'd like to highlight, as we transition into this discussion of specific states, that legal precedents are established only for exemption of state sales tax specifically. If a state or locality imposes another tax, like a convenience tax, bed tax, tourism tax, there is no legal precedent to support exemption, even for centrally billed accounts. Therefore, assessed taxes that are non-state sales tax are allowable. This is one of the most important concepts for this class. States have the legal authority to assess state sales tax on cardholders. The merchants are only the collection point for the state sales tax and have no authority beyond complying with state sales tax collection laws, regulations, and policies. However, for all practical purposes, merchants are often asked to interpret the eligibility of cardholders for state sales tax exemption, which there may be varying degrees of ability for these merchants to accurately do so. It is important to note that if a merchant improperly determines that a cardholder is tax exempt, the state has the authority to collect the taxes from the merchant and assess penalties. What this means is that merchants are responsible for both interpreting state sales tax law and are financially responsible for correctly determining whether or not to assess state sales tax. There is likely little to no state penalty for overcollecting state sales tax for merchants. Understanding that the financial risk is completely on merchants, many merchants are incentivized to err on the side of collecting sales tax, even if there is an eligible exemption, to avoid the risk of penalties. In addition, the federal government does not have any enforcement authority in the eligibility determination or collection of state sales tax. This often results in confusion of what taxes are due when by both the merchant and the cardholder. Merchants might exempt or not exempt taxes, not necessarily based on state law or policy, but when they feel the most comfortable doing so based on their own assessment of risk. All 50 states and U.S. territories exempt direct sales tax on centrally billed transactions. There are 4 states where this absolute statement is slightly less absolute, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Please note that for individually billed and centrally billed accounts, states may, but some may not, have documentation requirements. These are determined by the state, and the federal government, again, does not have the authority to change state documentation requirements for state sales tax exemption. To help navigate state sales tax exemption and documentation requirements, there is a state sales tax map available on the GSA SmartPay website. As of now, there are about a dozen states and a few U.S. territories that choose to offer state sales tax exemption for federal government travelers. This state sales tax exemption is offered sometimes as a courtesy to the federal government. There are some states that do not have a state sales tax, like Alaska or Delaware. Again, the exemption is for state sales tax only, and municipalities have the right to assess other taxes on the transaction, like an entertainment tax or tourism tax. Just a quick note, in some states, it is often unclear if a merchant is required by state law to exempt state sales tax for exempt entities like the federal government. What this means is there is a legal justification for a merchant to determine that an individually billed account is exempt from state sales tax, but the merchant is not legally required to do so. As I mentioned in the How Most States Collect Sales Tax slide, all states and U.S. territories must exempt state sales tax for centrally billed accounts. There is a little complexity here. In most states, the state directly assesses taxes on the cardholder in the form of a state sales tax. The merchant collects the tax and then provides the revenue from the state sales tax directly to the state. In the 4 states on this slide, the state does not directly assess sales tax on the cardholder. Rather, the state taxes the merchant in the form of a gross receipts tax. It is important to understand that a gross receipts tax is not a state sales tax. It is also important to note that merchants have the ability to pass along the amount of the gross receipts tax to the cardholder. This pass along tax is not considered a state sales tax and therefore is allowable. Even though the pass along tax may effectively perform a function similar to that of a state sales tax, it is not legally considered a state sales tax. 2 important points here. Merchants may not be required to pass along the gross receipts tax to the cardholder, meaning merchants can choose to absorb the cost of the tax as a courtesy to the government. Some state governments may extend an exemption of the gross receipts tax for the merchants when transacting with the federal government. If the merchant seeks the exemption, which again is not required, then the merchant can forego the pass-along tax. Now let's talk about how the GSA Center for Charge Card Management supports agency charge card programs and cardholders. The Center for Charge Card Management engaged in a state sales tax recovery pilot project in 2013. The pilot project tested the hypothesis that a significant amount in taxes were being improperly assessed and collected by states and merchants. The results of the pilot project did not support the hypothesis, as the team was only able to prove improper state sales tax collection and ultimate recovery of a very small fraction of transactions. The most important finding and lessons learned from the pilot project is the importance of education and knowledge of both the merchants and the cardholder at the point of sales. As such, the program has focused efforts to educating and providing information and resources to cardholders, states, and merchants. Our office attempts to continuously coordinate and communicate with state departments of revenue to document the changes to state tax laws and policies and document requirements. Unfortunately, the responsiveness of states are inconsistent and few proactively notify the federal government of changes to laws and policies. One of the best resources for us to keeping our information current and up to date have been cardholders and AOPCs sharing information with our program if they notice a discrepancy or inconsistency. We then work with the state to verify potential updates. Our online resources include a state tax map with the most recent collected information for exemption and documentation requirements, vendor guides providing merchants with information about state sales tax exemption, and how to recognize GSA SmartPay cards and BIN numbers. A quick note here. The website includes identification information to help states and merchants identify federal government cards to determine if a card is centrally billed or individually billed. The 6-digit identifier is only applicable to the travel business line. This means that a purchase card, for instance, with a 6-digit of 1, 2, 3, or 4, which usually denotes individually billed for travel card accounts only, is actually a centrally billed solution that is exempt from sales tax. The program developed a frequently asked questions section about taxes that might be helpful. These are a collection of questions that we hear from charge card managers like you, agency management, cardholders, states, and merchants. We update these regularly, and if there are any questions that you get but are not included in this section, please feel free to contact me. Thank you for attending this class. As a final reminder, the topics that we've discussed today were for informational purposes only and should not be considered a formal interpretation of law, tax advice, or recommendations to changes to existing policy. I hope you enjoyed the class and found the information helpful for performing your duties as an agency charge card manager or approving official. I look forward to interacting with you, fielding questions, and sharing agency experiences on the live chat.